You lie awake at night, replaying conversations you can't undo, decisions that can't be changed, and outcomes that are already written in stone. Every day you exhaust yourself fighting battles that were lost before you even entered the arena, pouring precious energy into circumstances completely beyond your control, while the things you actually can influence slip through your fingers. I am Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor who learned to find unshakable peace while bearing the weight of the most powerful empire in history. Through plague, war, and betrayal, I discovered that true strength comes not from controlling the world around you, but from mastering your response to what you cannot change. The Stoic principles I'll share will transform your relationship with acceptance, giving you the inner fortress that no external circumstance can breach. What sustains me through the darkest moments of ruling millions can free you from the exhausting cycle of fighting unchangeable realities. But first, like this video, subscribe for more Stoic wisdom, and comment where you're watching from. I want to see how far the need for true acceptance has spread across the world. I never wanted to be emperor. That burden was meant for my adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, the golden child who seemed born for command. But fate, as I would later learn, cares nothing for our preferences or plans. When Antoninus Pius chose me as his successor, I felt the weight of 60 million souls settle upon my shoulders like a mountain of marble in those early years. I believed the ultimate power of Rome meant ultimate control. I thought that with legions at my command, with the authority to speak law into existence, with advisors and governors extending my will across 3 continents, I could shape reality itself. How naive I was. How utterly, completely naive. I remember the first time I truly understood my powerlessness. It was during the Great Plague that swept through our empire, what history may call the Antonine Plague. I sat in my study, surrounded by reports from every corner of our domain. Alexandria, 20,000 dead in a month. Antioch, entire districts abandoned. Even Rome itself reeked with funeral pyres that burned day and night. I called my best physicians. I commanded them to find a cure. I ordered prayers in every temple, sacrifices to every god. I dispatched my finest administrators to organize relief. I threw the full weight of imperial authority against this invisible enemy, as if I could command disease itself to retreat like barbarian armies beyond our borders. But the plague cared nothing for my purple cloak or golden laurels. It killed senators and slaves with equal indifference. It swept through my own household, taking servants I had known for years, advisors who had become friends, when it finally claimed my adoptive brother Lucius Verus, the man who should have been emperor instead of me. I realized a truth that would transform everything. There are forces in this world that no amount of power can touch. I spent sleepless nights reading dispatch after dispatch, each one containing numbers that represented thousands of individual tragedies I could not prevent. Fathers burying children, wives mourning husbands, entire families erased from existence, while I, the most powerful man in the world, could do nothing but watch. That's when the letters began arriving, not official reports, but personal pleas. A mother in Gaul begging me to bring back her son. A merchant in Egypt asking why the gods would allow such suffering if I truly had their favor. A soldier's widow demanding to know why my power could not protect those who served me faithfully. Each letter was a mirror reflecting my fundamental impotence. Here I was, master of the known world, yet I could not master a thing too small to see. I could move mountains of stone to build monuments, but I could not move this microscopic enemy that moved freely through my empire. I could command the loyalty of men who would die at my word, but I could not command life itself to respect my authority. The breaking point came when I received a scroll from my personal physician, Galen. His words were careful, diplomatic, but the message was clear. Caesar, We have exhausted every remedy known to medicine. Some forces are beyond human intervention, even imperial intervention. We must learn to endure what we cannot cure. I threw that scroll across the room in rage. How dare fate make me emperor only to teach me the limits of emperorship? How dare the gods give me supreme authority over everything except the things that mattered most? In that moment of fury, hurling parchment at marble walls, I was no different from any frustrated man raging against circumstances beyond his control. But in the silence that followed my outburst, something shifted. I picked up that scroll and read Galen's words again. We must learn to endure what we cannot cure. Not control, not command, endure, accept, adapt to reality instead of demanding that reality adapt to me. That night, as I walked through the imperial gardens under stars that had watched emperors rise and fall for centuries, I began to understand that true power might not lie in controlling external circumstances, but in mastering my response to them. The plague would run its course regardless of my commands. People would die regardless of my wishes. But how I faced these unchangeable realities that remained within my control. This was my first lesson in acceptance. Though I didn't yet have the philosophical framework to understand it fully, it would take the wisdom of Stoic teachers to help me see that this moment of apparent powerlessness was actually the beginning of real strength. It was Junius, Rusticus, who changed everything. My old teacher appeared at the palace one morning, 3 months after the plague had taken Lucius Verus, carrying a worn scroll under his arm. He found me in my private study, surrounded by reports I could no longer bear to read. Staring at maps of an empire I was learning I could not truly govern. "You look like a man at war with the world," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the easy familiarity of someone who had known me since boyhood. "The world is winning," I replied bitterly. "Every day brings new proof that everything I thought I knew about power was an illusion." Rusticus smiled not with mockery, but with the gentle recognition of someone who had walked this path before. He placed the scroll on my desk. "Then perhaps it's time you learned about real power. The kind that no plague can touch, no barbarian can conquer, no senate can vote away." The scroll contained the teachings of Epictetus, a former slave turned philosopher. I almost laughed at the irony. Here I was, the most powerful man alive, about to learn wisdom from someone who had once been property. But as I began to read his words, something inside me stirred a recognition, as if I were remembering something I had once known but forgotten. "Some things are within our power," Epictetus wrote, "while others are not. Within our power are opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever is of our own doing. Not within our power are our body, our property, reputation, position, and, in a word, whatever is not of our own doing." I read that passage 3 times before. Its full meaning struck me. This slave philosopher was describing exactly what I had discovered during the plague, but with clarity I had been unable to achieve. He was drawing a line through reality itself, separating what could be controlled from what could only be accepted. Roost watched me read, his eyes twinkling with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student was finally ready for the lesson. "Tell me," he said, "what have you learned about your empire these past months?" "That I don't really rule it," I admitted. "Disease comes when it will. People die regardless of my wishes. Barbarians attack despite my threats. Natural disasters destroy decades of progress in moments. I command everything except the things that actually matter." "And how does that make you feel?" "Powerless, frustrated, like I'm failing everyone who depends on me." Rusticus leaned forward. "Now tell me, who decides what those events mean? Who chooses how you respond to them? Who determines whether you face them with wisdom or rage, acceptance or bitterness?" The answer came to me like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "I do, exactly. You cannot control the plague, but you can control your response to it. You cannot stop barbarians from testing your borders, but you can control how you prepare and react. You cannot prevent people from dying, but you can control how you honor their lives and comfort their families. This was revelation wrapped in simplicity. For months, I had been exhausting myself trying to control the vast machinery of fate, when my real sphere of influence was much smaller but infinitely more important. My thoughts, my reactions, my choices, my character. These belonged to me completely, and no external force could touch them without my permission. Rusticus left me more scrolls, works by Chrysippus, Cleanthus, and other Stoic masters. I devoured them with the hunger of a man discovering water in the desert. Each teaching reinforced the central insight. True freedom comes not from controlling what happens to you, but from controlling your response to what happens to you. I began practicing what they called the discipline of assent, questioning my initial emotional reactions to events and choosing more rational responses. When news arrived of Germanic tribes massing on our borders, instead of flying into rage about their audacity, I paused and asked, what can I actually control here? The answer was clear: my preparation, my strategy, my leadership of the response. Their decision to attack was theirs alone. I started keeping a journal, writing down these philosophical insights and applying them to daily imperial challenges. When a senator criticized my policies, instead of taking it as a personal attack, I examined whether his criticism contained wisdom I could use. When a provincial governor mismanaged his territory, instead of raging about incompetence, I focused on what I could do: provide better training, clearer instructions, or find a replacement. The transformation was gradual but profound. The weight of empire that had nearly crushed me began to feel manageable, not because the empire had changed. The same plagues, rebellions, and natural disasters continued, but because I had changed. I stopped fighting reality and started working with it. My advisors noticed the difference. Where once I had raged and demanded impossible solutions, now I asked better questions. What aspects of this situation can we influence? How do we respond wisely to what we cannot change? What can this challenge teach us about governing more effectively? This philosophical awakening didn't make governing easier, but it made it possible. I learned to channel my energy toward what I could actually affect, instead of dissipating it in futile battles against unchangeable circumstances. The slave philosopher Epictetus had given me something no amount of imperial power could provide: sovereignty over my own mind. Looking back, I realized that night with Rusticus and those scrolls marked the true beginning of my reign. Not when I took the purple, but when I learned what it meant to rule the one domain that was truly mine, myself. The next morning, I did something no emperor had ever done before. I carved the fundamental truth of Stoicism into stone, not in some grand public monument, but in a simple marble tablet I placed on my desk where I would see it every day. On one side, I carved within my control; on the other, beyond my control. This wasn't merely philosophical decoration. This tablet became my decision-making tool, my guide through every imperial challenge that crossed my desk. Before reacting to any situation, I would touch that stone and ask, which side does this belong on? Let me share how this simple practice transformed my approach to ruling an empire. When reports arrived that Germanic tribes were raiding our northern provinces, my first instinct was rage. How dare they attack Roman territory? But I touched the stone and asked the question. Their decision to raid, beyond my control, that was already done. Their future attacks, beyond my control. I could not reach into their minds and change their intentions. But my response, completely within my control. The speed and effectiveness of our military reaction, the strategies we employed, the messages we sent through our response, these were mine to determine. I stopped wasting energy being angry about what had already happened and focused entirely on crafting the most effective response possible. The difference was remarkable. Instead of emotional reactions that often led to hasty, poorly planned military campaigns, I began responding with calculated precision. I could deploy legions strategically, negotiate from positions of strength, and sometimes prevent conflicts entirely through diplomatic solutions that an angry emperor would never have considered. When a provincial governor embezzled funds meant for aqueduct construction, I applied the same principle. His past corruption, beyond my control, the money was already stolen, the trust already broken, but my response to his corruption, entirely within my sphere of influence. I could remove him, prosecute him, implement better oversight systems, and ensure the aqueduct was completed with proper funding. This practice revealed something profound about human nature. We consistently invest our emotional energy in the wrong places. A senator would come to me furious about grain shortages in his province, demanding I do something about the weather that had caused poor harvests. I would point to my stone tablet and ask, "Can we control rainfall?" The answer was always no. Can we control our response to poor harvests? Always yes. This redirected our focus toward actionable solutions, improving grain storage, diversifying supply sources, developing better distribution networks, creating emergency reserves. Instead of raging against weather gods, we built systems that could weather any storm. I taught this principle to my military commanders, and it revolutionized our approach to warfare. They stopped wasting time complaining about enemy tactics or challenging terrain and started focusing on adapting their strategies to whatever conditions they faced. You cannot control where the enemy chooses to fight, but you can control how well prepared you are for any battlefield. My personal physician, Galen, became fascinated by how this philosophy affected my health. He observed that my blood pressure remained stable even during crises, my sleep improved despite increased responsibilities, and my digestion functioned normally even when receiving disturbing news. "You have discovered," he told me, "how to separate emotional turbulence from practical action." The tablet also helped me understand relationships differently. When my son Commodus made decisions I disagreed with, I had to accept that his choices belonged to him, not me. I could offer guidance, provide education, set boundaries, and model better behavior all within my control. But I could not reach into his mind and rewire his character. That liberation freed me to be a better father by focusing on what I could actually contribute to his development, rather than trying to control his every thought and action. I began sharing this practice with trusted advisors, creating what we called the Imperial Decision Matrix. Before any major policy discussion, we would categorize every aspect of the situation: economic conditions beyond our borders, beyond our control, our trade policies in response to those conditions, within our control, the personal ambitions of foreign kings, beyond our control, our diplomatic strategies for working with those ambitions, within our control. This systematic approach eliminated so much wasted effort. We stopped holding endless meetings about problems we couldn't solve, and started having focused discussions about responses we could implement. Instead of lamenting that barbarian tribes were becoming more organized, we developed better intelligence networks and more flexible military strategies. The most powerful discovery was how this principle applied to my own reputation and legacy. What future historians would write about my reign? Beyond my control, I could not reach across time and dictate their opinions, but the actions they would have to evaluate, completely within my control. This freed me from the paralyzing anxiety about how I would be remembered and allowed me to focus entirely on governing with wisdom and integrity. The stone tablet became more than a tool. It became a symbol of inner freedom. Every time I touched it, I was reminded that no external circumstance could disturb my peace of mind without my permission. Plagues might ravage the empire, but they could not touch my equanimity. Senators might plot against my policies, but they could not reach my inner tranquility. Even death itself, when it comes for me, can only take what was never truly mine to begin with. This is the foundation of all. Stoic wisdom, learning to distinguish between what belongs to you and what belongs to the world. Master this distinction, and you will find a peace that no external force can disturb. Asterisk, asterisk, I kept bronze chains on my desk, not as decoration, but as a daily reminder of the most insidious form of slavery, the bondage we create through resistance to reality. These chains represented something I had discovered through painful experience. Every moment we spend fighting what has already happened, we forge another link in the prison of our own making. Let me tell you about the year I nearly broke myself. Through resistance, it began with news that shattered my carefully constructed philosophical equilibrium. Avidius Cassius, one of my most trusted generals, had declared himself emperor while I was away handling Germanic invasions. Not only had he rebelled against my authority, but reports suggested that my own wife, Faustina, might have encouraged his revolt. Perhaps believing rumors of my death in the northern campaigns, my initial reaction was pure, volcanic rage. I had promoted Cassius, trusted him with entire legions, treated him like a son. And Faustina, if the reports were true, my own wife had conspired against me. I spent 3 days consumed by fury, plotting elaborate punishments, imagining speeches I would give before executing traitors, rehearsing the moment when I would look into their eyes and let them see the full weight of imperial justice. But something strange happened during those 3 days of rage. I accomplished nothing. While I burned with anger about what had already occurred, the rebellion continued to spread. While I planned revenge against betrayals that were already facts, more provinces declared for Cassius. My resistance to what had happened was paralyzing my ability to respond to what was happening. On the 4th morning, I stared at those bronze chains and realized I was wearing invisible ones. My anger had become my prison. Every moment I spent raging about Cassius's past decision to rebel was a moment stolen from addressing his present rebellion. Every hour I wasted feeling betrayed by Faustina was an hour I could have spent securing the loyalty of remaining provinces. That's when I grasped the cruel mathematics of resistance. The energy you spend fighting reality is energy unavailable for changing what can still be changed. Resistance doesn't alter the past. It only handicaps your future. I made a conscious choice that morning to stop fighting facts. Cassius had rebelled. This was now simply information, not a source of emotional torment. Faustina might have supported him. This became data rather than devastation. The question was not whether these things should have happened differently, but how to respond most effectively to what was happening now. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Freed from the exhausting work of resistance, my mind cleared completely. Instead of rage, I felt strategic clarity. Instead of planning revenge, I planned resolution. Within hours, I had crafted a response that would have been impossible while I was consumed with fighting reality. I wrote letters to Cassius and to the provinces that had joined him, not as an angry emperor demanding submission, but as a philosophical leader offering understanding. I acknowledged that if they truly believed I was dead, supporting another candidate made sense. I explained that I was very much alive and willing to discuss their concerns rather than simply crush their rebellion. Most importantly, I announced that when this crisis ended, not if, but when there would be no mass executions, no reign of terror, no systematic revenge, I would treat this as a misunderstanding born of incomplete information rather than a criminal conspiracy deserving death. This approach, born from releasing resistance, accomplished what rage never could have achieved. Several provinces immediately returned to my side. recognizing that I offered reconciliation rather than retribution. Military commanders who had been wavering decided that an emperor who responded to rebellion with philosophy rather than fury might be worth serving. After all, the resolution came sooner than anyone expected. When Cassius's own officers realized I was approaching with mercy rather than vengeance, they assassinated him and sent me his head, hoping to earn favor. I felt no satisfaction in his death, only sadness. That resistance on both sides had made reconciliation impossible. But I learned something profound about the nature of resistance that would serve me for the rest of my reign. The moment you stop fighting what has already happened, you discover tremendous energy for influencing what happens next. Resistance is like trying to push a river backward. It exhausts you without changing the direction of the water. Acceptance is like stepping into the current and directing your swimming toward where you want to reach shore. I began teaching this principle to my closest advisors through practical exercises. When bad news arrived, I would require a mandatory pause before any emotional reaction. During this pause, we would acknowledge the reality completely. This has happened. These are the facts. Resistance cannot change them. Only then would we move to response. Given these unchangeable facts, what can we still influence? This practice revealed how much energy we habitually waste on resistance. A grain shortage in Egypt would typically generate hours of discussion about why it shouldn't have happened, who was to blame, and how unfair it was to the people. All wasted motion. Now we would spend 5 minutes acknowledging the shortage as reality, then dedicate our full energy to managing distribution, securing alternative supplies, and preventing future shortages. The bronze chains on my desk became a symbol of liberation through acceptance. Every time I felt the familiar tug of resistance, the desire to rail against circumstances beyond my control, would touch those chains, and remember, you can wear the invisible shackles of fighting reality, or you can walk free by accepting what is and focusing your power on what could be. I discovered that acceptance is not passive surrender, but active wisdom. When you stop spending energy on fighting unchangeable facts, you discover reserves of strength you never knew you possessed. This is the difference between a leader who exhausts himself, raging against circumstances, and one who channels his full power toward effective action. The paradox of resistance is that it promises control but delivers helplessness. True power emerges only when you release the illusion that reality should conform to your preferences and embrace the truth that your preferences must work with reality. Asterisk. I carry a gold coin in my toga every day, one I had specially minted with an image of death, a skeleton holding an hourglass. The inscription reads, Memento Mori. Remember, you must die. My advisors think it's morbid, but this coin has been my greatest teacher in the art of acceptance. Most people flee from thoughts of death as if ignoring mortality could somehow postpone it. I learned to do the opposite. I made death my daily companion and discovered it was the key to everything I had been struggling to accept. The lesson began with my adoptive father, Antoninus Pius. For 23 years, he had been the steady center of my world, wise, patient, seemingly eternal. When the fever took him, I watched the most powerful man I knew become helpless against something invisible. His final weeks taught me that death respects no titles, fears no authority, yields to no amount of gold or influence. I sat beside his bed during those last days, watching him struggle with the same resistance I had felt about everything else. Beyond my control, he would rage about unfinished projects, worry about the empire's future, desperately try to cram final instructions into his failing breath. I realized I was watching my own future, lest I learned to accept the one certainty that makes all other acceptances possible. After his funeral, I began what I called my death practice. Each morning, before reviewing imperial business, I would hold that gold coin and imagine this day as my last, not in a morbid way, but as a clarifying exercise. If I only had today, would I waste energy being angry about yesterday's senatorial criticism? Would I spend precious hours trying to control my son's choices? Would I exhaust myself fighting circumstances already written in stone? The coin taught me that death anxiety underlies most of our resistance to change. We fight the loss of youth because we fear approaching death. We resist changes in relationships because we fear the death of how things used to be. We battle setbacks because they remind us that everything we build will eventually crumble. Our inability to accept mortality poisons our ability to accept anything temporal. I began teaching this insight to my commanders during our Germanic campaigns. Soldiers who thought constantly about avoiding death fought with desperate, ineffective panic. But soldiers who had truly accepted death as inevitable fought with calm precision and strategic thinking. They could focus on winning rather than merely surviving because they had already made peace with the ultimate outcome. The most profound lesson came when I lost my own children. When my daughter Anya died at barely 20 years old, the grief nearly broke me. How could I accept the death of someone who should have outlived me by decades? How could philosophy console a father watching his child's funeral pyre? But the gold coin reminded me of a harsh truth. From the moment our children are born, we know they will die. We just pretend they won't, creating the illusion of permanence where none exists. My grief was real and necessary, but my resistance to the fact of her death was optional suffering I was adding to unavoidable pain. I realized that acceptance of death doesn't mean becoming cold or uncaring. It means loving fully while acknowledging the temporary nature of everything we love. When I accepted that every conversation with my remaining children might be our last, I stopped taking them for granted. When I accepted that every day with my wife might be final, I stopped postponing expressions of affection for more convenient moments. The death practice transformed my approach to imperial legacy as well. Previous emperors exhausted themselves trying to build monuments that would preserve their memory forever. But forever is an illusion. Even marble crumbles, even bronze corrodes. When I accepted that my reign, like my life, was temporary, I stopped trying to achieve immortality and started focusing on doing good while I had the chance. I began each day by acknowledging 3 truths. I will die, everyone I love will die, and everything I build will eventually be destroyed. This might sound depressing, but it was actually liberating. Once you truly accept the impermanence of everything, you stop wasting energy trying to make temporary things permanent and start appreciating them for what they are, precious gifts with expiration dates. The Germanic wars provided daily practice in this acceptance. Every morning, I would see my soldiers' faces and know that some would not survive the day. Every evening, I would receive casualty reports and feel the weight of lives lost under my command. The temptation was to become numb, or to rage against the unfairness of death in war. Instead, I used each loss to deepen my appreciation for those still living. I started a practice of writing personal letters to the families of fallen soldiers, not because imperial protocol required it, but because their temporary sacrifice deserved permanent acknowledgement. Accepting death didn't make me indifferent to it made me more present to its significance. The coin also taught me about time. When you truly accept that your days are numbered, not in some abstract future sense, but as a present reality, you stop postponing important conversations, meaningful experiences, and expressions of love. You realize that someday is a luxury you may not have. I began treating each sunset as potentially my last, each meal as possibly final, each conversation as maybe goodbye. This wasn't morbid obsession, but grateful presence. When you know something is temporary, you pay attention in ways you never do when you assume permanence. Death became my teacher in acceptance, because it represents the ultimate unchangeable reality. You cannot negotiate with it, bribe it, or delay it indefinitely. You can only learn to face it with dignity and use awareness of it to live more fully while you can. The gold coin reminds me daily that acceptance of death is practice for acceptance of everything else. If you can make peace with your own mortality, you can make peace with any change, any loss, any circumstance beyond your control. Death is the final test of acceptance and the final liberation from resistance. Asterisk, asterisk, the scrolls arrived every morning like harbingers of doom. Casualty reports from across the empire, each number representing someone's father, mother, child, or spouse claimed by the plague that had been ravaging our world for 7 relentless years. By the time I received my physician Galen's final count, we had lost nearly 5 million souls, more than died in all our military campaigns combined. I remember the morning when the reality of our powerlessness became undeniable. Galen entered my study carrying a scroll he could barely hold steady, his usually confident demeanor replaced by the hollow look of a man who had watched medicine fail completely. "Caesar," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we have lost Alexandria. Not to barbarians or rebellion, to an enemy we could not see, could not fight, could not negotiate with. The great city that had stood for 5 centuries, the intellectual heart of our empire, was now a ghost town where funeral pyres burned day and night and survivors fled in terror. I walked to my window overlooking Rome and saw the same scene repeated in miniature. Empty streets where bustling crowds had once filled every space, abandoned shops with doors sealed by fearful owners, the nauseating smoke of constant cremations turning our beautiful sky into a grey shroud of grief. This was my education in acceptance under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. As emperor, I was supposed to protect my people, yet I was watching millions die while the full power of Rome proved utterly helpless. Every instinct screamed at me to do something, anything, to stop this invisible destroyer of worlds. I tried everything. I ordered massive sacrifices to every god in our pantheon, hoping divine intervention might succeed where human effort had failed. I brought physicians from every corner of the empire to study the disease and develop treatments. I implemented quarantine measures, distributed food to lockdown areas, and organized relief efforts for orphaned children and widowed families. Nothing worked. The plague continued its methodical destruction of everything I had sworn to preserve. Each morning brought fresh reports of cities falling silent, of entire families erased from existence, of once prosperous provinces reduced to scattered survivors, telling stories of the dead. The breaking point came when the plague reached my own household, not just servants and distant relatives, but people I saw daily, spoke with regularly, cared about personally. My teacher, Junius Rusticus, who had introduced me to Stoic philosophy, died coughing blood in his bed while I held his hand. My closest advisor's entire family was wiped out in a week. Even Galen, my personal physician, fell ill, though he eventually recovered. Watching Rusticus die was the moment I truly understood what acceptance meant under impossible circumstances. He faced his final days without rage, without demanding that reality be different, without exhausting his remaining energy fighting the unchangeable fact of his illness. Instead, he used his last conversations to share final wisdom and express gratitude for the life he had lived. "Marcus," he whispered during one of our final talks, "this plague is not happening to you personally. It is simply happening, and you happen to be emperor during its occurrence. Your suffering comes not from the plague itself, but from your belief that emperors should be able to prevent plagues." That distinction changed everything. I had been taking the plague personally, as if it was some cosmic judgment on my fitness to rule. I had been torturing myself with the fantasy that a better emperor, a more worthy leader, could have somehow prevented or stopped this catastrophe. Rusticus helped me see that my personal anguish was separate from the practical challenge of governing. During crisis, once I stopped fighting the fact that the plague was happening, I could focus entirely on responding effectively to its effects. Instead of wasting energy on rage about circumstances beyond any human control, I channeled everything into managing what remained within my sphere of influence. I organized the largest relief effort in Roman history, not because I believed it would stop the plague, but because helping survivors was something I could actually do. I established orphanages for children who had lost their families, not because this would bring back their parents, but because care for the living was within my power. I restructured imperial finances to support plague-affected provinces, not because money could cure disease, but because economic stability was something I could provide. I maintained military discipline and border security despite massive personnel losses, not because I could replace the dead, but because protecting what remained was my responsibility. Most importantly, I began visiting affected areas personally, not because my presence could heal anyone, but because seeing their emperor share their risks might provide some comfort to people who felt abandoned by both gods and government. These visits taught me the deepest lesson about acceptance during crisis. People don't need you to fix the unfixable, but they do need you to remain steady while the unfixable runs its course. They don't need their leader to stop the unstoppable, but they do need to see that leadership continues to function even when normal solutions fail. I learned to distinguish between two types of suffering: the unavoidable pain of living through catastrophe and the optional suffering of resistance to catastrophe. The plague would cause tremendous pain regardless of my attitude toward it, but I could choose whether to add the extra layer of suffering that comes from fighting reality. By accepting the plague as an unchangeable fact rather than a personal affront, I discovered reserves of strength I never knew I possessed. When you stop exhausting yourself fighting what cannot be changed, you find tremendous energy for addressing what can still be influenced. The plague eventually ended, as all plagues do, leaving behind an empire transformed by loss, but still functioning. We had survived not because we defeated an undefeatable enemy, but because we learned to maintain purpose and effectiveness while accepting circumstances completely beyond our control. Those 7 years taught me that acceptance is not about becoming passive in the face of challenges. It's about becoming clear-eyed about which aspects of any challenge are changeable and which are not. Then investing your full energy in the changeable while making peace with the unshedged ungeable. The plague was my graduate education in acceptance, and its lessons served me through every subsequent crisis of my reign. Asterisk on my desk. I keep pieces of a broken wax seal fragments of the signet ring that once belonged to Avidius Cassius, the general who betrayed me. Most people would have thrown away such painful reminders, but I keep these pieces as a daily lesson in accepting the unchangeable nature of human beings. The betrayal cut deeper than any Germanic sword. Cassius wasn't just a subordinate I had treated him like a son, promoted him over more senior commanders, trusted him with entire legions and the defense of our eastern provinces. When word reached me that he had declared himself emperor, using false reports of my death as justification, I felt something break inside my chest that had nothing to do with imperial authority and everything to do with personal trust. But the real devastation came from the accompanying reports. My own wife, Faustina, may have encouraged his rebellion. My trusted advisors might have secretly supported his claim. People I had shared meals with, confided in, treated as family, they had been calculating how to benefit from my supposed death while smiling at my very much alive face. My first impulse was to rage against their ingratitude, their treachery, their fundamental unfairness. How could people I had treated with such generosity repay me with such betrayal? How could those who had benefited most from my trust be the first to abandon it when circumstances changed? How could human nature be so fundamentally unreliable? Spent sleepless nights rehearsing speeches about loyalty, planning elaborate punishments for traitors, imagining the moment when I would look into their eyes and show them the consequences of betraying someone who had loved them. The broken seal pieces sat on my desk like evidence in a trial where I was simultaneously judge, jury, and wounded victim. But then I remembered something Epictetus had written about expecting disappointment from others. When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they can't tell good from evil. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own. The wisdom struck me like a lightning bolt. I had been betrayed not because Cassius and the others were uniquely evil, but because they were typically human. Human beings act from self-interest, fear, ambition, and incomplete information. Expecting them to transcend their nature was like expecting water to flow uphill, possible in theory, but foolish to count on in practice. I began to see that my pain came not from their betrayal itself, but from my unrealistic expectations about human reliability. I had projected onto them a consistency and loyalty that exists more in philosophical ideals than in actual people. The disappointment I felt was the gap between my fantasy of human nature and the reality of human nature. This realization led to a profound shift in how I approached relationships and governance. Instead of expecting people to be better than they typically are, I began accepting them as they actually are, while still hoping they might sometimes rise above their usual patterns. I started evaluating advisors and generals based on their demonstrated character under pressure rather than their promises during calm periods. I created systems that assumed people might act from self-interest rather than pure loyalty, building in checks and balances that would function even if individuals disappointed me. When I finally dealt with Cassius's rebellion, I did so without personal venom. His officers killed him before I arrived, hoping to earn favor with me, but I felt no satisfaction in his death. Instead, I felt sadness that his fear and ambition had led him to choices that ultimately destroyed him. I pardoned most of his supporters, not because I approved of their betrayal, but because I understood it. They had acted from incomplete information and self-preservation instincts that are basic to human nature. Punishing them harshly would be like punishing fish for swimming or birds for flying, a waste of energy directed at unchangeable nature. The broken seal pieces now remind me daily of a crucial truth. Other people's choices belong to them completely. I cannot control whether they will be loyal or treacherous, grateful or demanding, honest or deceptive. I can only control how I prepare for their humanity and how I respond to their choices. This acceptance transformed my leadership style completely. Instead of leading with hurt feelings when people disappointed me, I learned to lead with clear boundaries and realistic expectations. Instead of taking betrayal personally, I began seeing it as information about character that could help me make better decisions going forward. I discovered that accepting human unreliability doesn't make you cynical, it makes you effective. When you stop expecting people to be angels, you can appreciate the moments when they choose virtue without being devastated when they choose selfishness. The practice also deepened my compassion. When I accepted that others would sometimes fail to meet my expectations, I had to confront how often I failed to meet my own standards. The same human nature that led Cassius to betray me also led me to moments of anger, pettiness, and poor judgment. We are all imperfect beings trying to navigate complex circumstances with limited wisdom. I began treating others' failures with the same understanding I hoped they would show mine. This didn't mean accepting harmful behavior without consequences. but it meant responding to that behavior without the additional poison of personal outrage. The broken seal became a symbol of liberation through acceptance. Every time I looked at those fragments, I was reminded that I could not control others' loyalty, but I could control my response to their disloyalty. I could not make people grateful, but I could continue acting with generosity regardless of their gratitude. I could not force others to be trustworthy, but I could remain worthy of trust myself. Most importantly, I learned that accepting human imperfection allows you to love people more fully, not less. When you release the demand that others be perfect, you can appreciate their actual virtues without the constant disappointment of unmet expectations. The betrayal that had once seemed like evidence of cosmic unfairness became a teacher in the art of loving humans as they are rather than as we wish they were. Asterisk, asterisk, I keep a polished bronze mirror on my desk, not for vanity, but for practicing what I call the discipline of perception, the daily exercise of examining how my mind creates, suffering through interpretation rather than fact. Each morning, I look into that mirror and ask myself a crucial question. What stories am I telling myself about yesterday's events that have nothing to do with what actually happened? The mirror taught me that we never experience events directly. We experience our interpretations of events. And most of our suffering comes not from what happens to us, but from the meaning we assign to what happens to us. Let me share how this discovery changed everything about my approach to acceptance. During the Germanic campaigns, we suffered a devastating defeat at a place called Carnuntum. I lost 3,000 men in a single day, good soldiers who had trusted my leadership and died because my strategy failed. The facts were simple. Poor intelligence, overconfident tactics, and enemy cunning combined to create disaster. But the story I told myself about those facts was far more complex and far more torturous. I convinced myself that a better emperor would have anticipated the ambush. I interpreted the defeat as evidence of my unworthiness to command. I transformed a tactical failure into a referendum on my character, my destiny, and my right to lead. I spent weeks in anguish, not because 3,000 men had died, that was the unchangeable fact, but because I had decided their deaths meant I was a failure as an emperor. The mirror forced me to separate these two things, the event itself and my interpretation of the event. Looking at my reflection, I began practicing what Stoics call the view from above, examining situations from a broader perspective that strips away emotional interpretation and reveals basic reality. 3,000 Romans died at Carnuntum. That was fact. Everything else, my shame, my self-doubt, my catastrophic predictions about the future, was interpretation. Once I learned to distinguish between facts and interpretations, I discovered I had choices I never knew existed. I could interpret the defeat as evidence of incompetence, or as valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities. I could see the dead soldiers as proof of my failure, or as heroes who had provided crucial information through their sacrifice. Could view the setback as a reason for despair, or as motivation for better preparation. The bronze mirror became my training ground for this mental discipline. Each morning, I would recall the previous day's most disturbing event and practice seeing it from multiple perspectives until I found interpretations that were both accurate and useful rather than accurate and destructive. When a senator criticized my policies in a particularly harsh speech, my initial interpretation was personal attack. He was questioning my fitness to rule. But the mirror helped me find alternative views. He was expressing genuine concern about imperial direction, or he was positioning himself politically, or he was testing whether I could handle disagreement gracefully. Each interpretation led to different responses and different emotional states. I began teaching this practice to my advisors through what we called perspective exercises. When someone brought me disturbing news, I would require them to present at least 3 different interpretations of the same facts before we discussed response options. This simple practice revealed how often our first interpretation, usually the most emotionally charged, was neither the most accurate nor the most useful. A provincial tax revolt could be interpreted as evidence of imperial weakness, or as a sign that local governance needed adjustment, or as proof that our economic policies were affecting people's daily lives in ways we hadn't considered. Each interpretation suggested different approaches and created different emotional climates. For decision-making, the discipline of perception proved especially valuable during personal relationships. When my son Commodus made choices I disapproved of, my initial interpretation was often that he was deliberately rejecting my values and guidance. But the mirror helped me see alternative possibilities. He was experimenting with independence, or responding to pressures I didn't understand, or simply making mistakes that were part of normal development. These alternative interpretations didn't change his behavior, but they completely changed my responses to his behavior. Instead of reacting from hurt feelings about perceived rejection, I could respond from curiosity about his actual motivations and needs. I discovered that most emotional suffering comes from interpretations that contain hidden assumptions about how reality should work. When I interpreted Commodus's poor choices as evidence that he didn't respect me, I was assuming that children should always make choices their parents approve of. When I interpreted the Germanic defeat as proof of my incompetence, I was assuming that good emperors never lose battles. The bronze mirror helped me identify and question these assumptions. Why should children always choose what parents prefer? Why should emperors win every military engagement? Why should advisors always agree with imperial decisions? Once I examined these assumptions, I often found they were unrealistic expectations that guaranteed disappointment. This practice led to what I call interpretation flexibility, the ability to consciously choose the most useful way of understanding any situation. I'm not talking about self-deception or positive thinking that ignores reality. I'm talking about recognizing that any complex situation can be accurately interpreted in multiple ways, and choosing interpretations that promote effective action, rather than emotional paralysis. When reports arrived that barbarian tribes were massing for another invasion, I could interpret this as evidence that our previous victories had been meaningless, or as proof that our strength was forcing enemies to organize more carefully, or as an opportunity to test new defensive strategies. All three interpretations might be accurate, but they would lead to very different approaches and emotional states. The discipline of perception became my most practical tool for daily acceptance. By learning to separate events from interpretations, I gained the freedom to choose responses based on effectiveness rather than automatic emotional reactions. The mirror reminded me every morning that while I couldn't control what happened to me, I had complete sovereignty over what I decided those events meant. This wasn't about becoming cold or detached, it was about becoming free to respond wisely, instead of reacting blindly. When you master the discipline of perception, you discover that acceptance becomes much easier, because you're accepting what actually happened rather than the elaborate stories you've created about what happened. I commissioned an architect to design something that would never be built, a fortress so perfectly constructed that no army could breach it, no siege could starve it, no weapon could damage it. The blueprints sit in my study, not as plans for actual construction, but as a map of what Stoics call the inner citadel, the unconquerable sanctuary that exists within every human mind. This imaginary fortress taught me the most important lesson about acceptance. While you cannot control the storms that rage around you, you can build an inner refuge that remains calm regardless of external chaos. The blueprint became my guide during the worst crisis of my Reigner period, when Germanic invasions, plague outbreaks, military rebellions, and political conspiracies all converged into what seemed like the perfect storm of imperial destruction. For months, I received nothing but catastrophic news. Every messenger brought reports of another disaster, another loss, another failure of systems I had spent years building. My advisors watched me during those dark months, expecting to see the strain of impossible pressures. They later told me they were amazed by my composure, not because I was unaffected by the crises, but because I seemed to have found some inner source of stability that external events couldn't touch. That stability came from understanding the architecture of the inner citadel. The fortress blueprints showed me that the unconquerable mind has several essential features. First, thick walls that separate what belongs to you from what belongs to the world. These walls are built from the fundamental Stoic recognition that your thoughts, judgments, and responses are your private territory. No external force can occupy them without your permission. When news arrived that 3 entire legions had been destroyed in Germanic ambushes, the outer world erupted in panic. Senators demanded explanations. Citizens questioned imperial competence. Allies wondered if Roman power was collapsing. But inside my inner citadel, I maintained a different perspective. Military defeats are temporary setbacks that provide information about enemy capabilities and our own strategic weaknesses. The panic and doubt swirling around me could not penetrate the walls of this understanding unless I opened the gates to let them in. The second architectural feature of the inner citadel is a deep well that never runs dry. Your capacity to find meaning and purpose regardless of circumstances. This well is fed not by external success, but by internal commitment to virtue and wisdom. Even when everything you've built crumbles, this source of meaning remains pure and available. During the plague years, when my efforts to protect the empire seemed futile and millions died despite every intervention I attempted, I could have despaired about the meaninglessness of imperial power. Instead, I drew from the well of inner purpose, my commitment to respond to crisis with wisdom, to care for people even when I couldn't save them, to maintain leadership even when leadership couldn't prevent catastrophe. This purpose didn't depend on success, it depended only on my choice to uphold it. The third feature is a watchtower that provides clear vision above the storms. From this elevated perspective, you can see that even the worst crises are temporary weather patterns that will eventually pass. The watchtower of the inner citadel reminds you that everything external is impermanent, both the disasters that threaten you and the successes that inflate you. When Avidius Cassius's rebellion spread across multiple provinces, and it seemed my empire might split apart, the watchtower perspective helped me remember that emperors had faced similar challenges before, and Rome had survived. This crisis, like all crises, was a temporary test rather than a permanent condition. Keeping this long view prevented me from making desperate decisions based on short-term panic. The fourth architectural element is a treasury filled not with gold, but with philosophical principles that retain their value regardless of external economic conditions. When political storms rage and practical strategies fail, these principles provide guidance that never becomes obsolete. During the worst moments of crisis, when advisors offered conflicting counsel and every decision seemed likely to end in disaster, I would retreat to this inner treasury and consult timeless principles. Act with virtue regardless of consequences. Focus on what you can control. Treat obstacles as opportunities to practice wisdom. Maintain compassion even for enemies. These principles worked as well during imperial crisis as they had during peaceful times. The final feature of the inner citadel is a training ground, where you practice maintaining composure under increasingly difficult conditions. Just as soldiers prepare for battle through military exercises, philosophers prepare for crisis through mental exercises that build spiritual strength. I developed daily practices that strengthened my ability to remain centered during chaos. Each morning, I would imagine the worst possible news arriving and practiced responding with equanimity rather than panic. I would visualize losing everything: empire, family, health, life itself, and work on maintaining inner peace regardless of loss. These weren't morbid fantasies, but strength training for the soul. The most important discovery about the inner citadel was that it grows stronger through use. Every time you choose calm over panic, wisdom over emotion, acceptance over resistance, you add another stone to walls that protect your peace of mind. Every crisis you weather without losing your center makes you more capable of handling the next storm. I learned to see external challenges not as threats to my well-being, but as opportunities to strengthen my inner fortress. Germanic invasions tested my strategic thinking. Plague outbreaks tested my ability to maintain hope during suffering. Political betrayals tested my capacity for forgiveness. Each test made the citadel more secure. The architect's blueprints taught me that the inner citadel isn't a place you retreat to escape the world. It's a sanctuary you carry with you that allows you to engage the world more effectively. When you know you have an unconquerable inner refuge, you can take greater risks, make bolder decisions, and face larger challenges, because your fundamental well-being doesn't depend on external outcomes. During my final campaign on the Danube frontier, as I write these words knowing death may come at any moment, I feel no anxiety about leaving the world. The inner citadel has taught me that what matters most, wisdom, virtue, the capacity for love and understanding, cannot be destroyed by any external force. These treasures belong to me completely and will remain with me until my final breath. The blueprint of the unconquerable fortress lives not in stone and mortar, but in the architecture of acceptance itself. Asterisk, asterisk, on my desk sits a painted portrait of my family, my wife Faustina, my children who lived, and empty spaces where I once placed smaller portraits of the children who died. This image has taught me the most difficult lesson in acceptance: how to love deeply while holding lightly, how to give your heart completely while knowing that everything you love is temporary. The lesson began with loss that nearly shattered me. My daughter, Anya Galleria Faustina, barely 20 years old and radiant with life, fell ill with a fever that no physician could cure. For days, I sat beside her bed, holding her hand and willing my imperial power to mean something in the face of death. I would have traded the entire empire for her recovery, given up my throne without hesitation to see her smile again. But death, as I had learned, respects no bargains. She died while I held her hand, her last breath escaping as gently as air, leaving a deflated bladder. In that moment, I understood that loving someone doesn't give you any claim over their fate. Love doesn't protect what you love from loss, only guarantees that loss will devastate you. Or so I thought, until philosophy taught me a different way. Epictetus, that former slave, who had become my greatest teacher through his writings, offered wisdom that initially seemed heartless. Never say about anything, "I have lost it," but only, "I have given it back." Is your child dead? It has been given back. Is your wife dead? She has been given back. My first reaction was outrage. How dare this man reduce my daughter's death to a simple transaction? How could he speak so coldly about the most precious relationships in human life? But as I studied his teaching more deeply, I began to understand the profound liberation it offered. The portrait on my desk became my teacher in this practice. Each morning, I would look at the faces of those I loved and remind myself, these people are not my possessions. They are gifts temporarily placed in my care. I cannot prevent their eventual departure, but I can choose how to love them while they remain. This wasn't about caring, less it was about caring more skillfully. When I accepted that Faustina would someday die, that my remaining children would eventually leave this world, that every person I loved was on loan from the universe, I stopped taking them for granted. Every conversation became precious because I knew our conversations were numbered. Every shared meal became significant because I understood that our time together was finite. The practice transformed my relationships completely. Instead of loving my family possessively, trying to control their choices, demanding they conform to my expectations, becoming angry when they disappointed me, I began loving them freely. I offered guidance without requiring obedience, provided support without expecting gratitude, shared affection without demanding reciprocation. When my son Commodus made decisions I disagreed with, instead of fighting to control his choices, I reminded myself that his life belonged to him, not me. I could offer wisdom based on experience, but I could not live his life for him. This acceptance didn't make me indifferent to his welfare, made me more effective at actually helping him, because my advice came from love rather than from attempts to control. The most profound change came in how I experienced love itself. When you love without attachment to permanent ownership, every moment of connection becomes a gift rather than an entitlement. When Faustina laughed at something I said, I didn't take it for granted because I knew that someday there would be a last time I heard her laughter. When my children sought my advice, I treasured their trust because I understood that children eventually stop needing their father's guidance. This approach to love proved especially valuable during my military campaigns. When I had to leave Rome for months at a time, fighting Germanic tribes along the Danube, I could have tortured myself with anxiety about what might happen to my family in my absence. Instead, I practiced what I called loving release, holding them in my heart while accepting that their safety was not within my control. I wrote letters expressing my love completely, as if each might be my final communication. I shared my feelings honestly, offered my thoughts freely, and gave my affection without reservation. But I didn't demand responses, didn't require that they wait for me unchanged, didn't insist that they organize their lives around my return. The portrait also taught me about grieving properly. When my daughter died, I felt the full weight of loss without adding the extra burden of resistance to loss. I mourned her death without pretending it shouldn't have happened. I missed her presence without denying the reality of her absence. I honored her memory without demanding that the universe should have arranged things differently. This distinction between the natural pain of loss and the unnecessary suffering of resistance to loss became crucial for my emotional well-being. Grief is love with nowhere to go. It's the price we pay for having cared deeply about someone who is gone. But resistance to loss adds layers of suffering that honor no one and help nothing. I learnt to grieve cleanly, feeling the full impact of separation without fighting the fact of separation. This allowed me to process loss more completely and return to loving the living with renewed appreciation for the time we had together. The practice of loving without attachment also applied to my role as emperor. I loved Rome and the empire deeply, but I had to accept that my reign was temporary and my influence limited. I could work diligently to improve governance, but I couldn't control how future emperors would lead. I could establish good policies, but I couldn't guarantee they would be maintained after my death. This acceptance freed me to govern more effectively because my decisions weren't contaminated by desperate attempts to create permanent legacies. I could focus on doing good work during my time in power without the paralysis that comes from trying to control outcomes beyond my lifespan. The portrait reminds me daily that love and acceptance are not opposites, they are partners. When you truly accept that everything you love is temporary, you love more fully while you can. When you release the illusion that love gives you ownership over what you love, you discover that love gives you something far more precious, the capacity to appreciate the gift of connection without the burden of control. This is perhaps the most advanced form of acceptance, learning to hold the people and things you cherish as precious gifts that you're privileged to experience, rather than possessions you're entitled to keep forever. Asterisk, asterisk. The sundial in my private garden bears inscriptions I carved myself. Time passes, whether we accept it or resist it, and each shadow marks not loss, but change. I watch this timepiece daily, observing how the sun's movement creates new patterns of light and shadow, reminding myself that aging is simply time made visible in human flesh. I write these words at 59, feeling my body's daily negotiations with mortality. My joints ache each morning until I move them deliberately. My eyes require more light for reading than they once did. My memory, while still sharp for philosophy and governance, sometimes fumbles with names of minor officials I met only briefly. My beard has turned completely grey, and my face bears lines that map every crisis I've weathered. There was a time when these changes tormented me. I remember the first morning I noticed grey threads in my dark hair. I was 43 and campaigning against Germanic tribes. My initial reaction was to pluck them out, as if I could fight time itself with tweezers. I ordered my servants to prepare dyes that might restore my youthful appearance, and I found myself avoiding mirrors that reflected uncomfortable truths about advancing years. The vanity embarrasses me now, but it taught me something crucial about human nature. We resist aging because we mistake our physical form for our essential self. We fight the natural processes of time because we believe that changing bodies mean diminishing worth. We deny the evidence of our senses because we cannot accept that everything in the material world, including ourselves, follows the universal law of impermanence. The turning point came during a particularly difficult winter campaign. I was studying tactical maps by lamplight when my vision blurred unexpectedly. For a moment, I panicked. Was this the beginning of blindness? Would I become an emperor who could no longer read intelligence reports or recognize the faces of his advisors? But then I applied the stoic practice I had learned, distinguishing between what I could control and what I could not. My eyes were aging according to natural law. I could not control this process any more than I could control the movement of stars. But my response to aging eyes, that remained entirely within my power. I could choose to rage against failing vision and waste energy fighting an unchangeable process, or I could adapt intelligently to new limitations while appreciating the capabilities that remained. I chose adaptation over resistance, and this choice transformed my entire relationship with aging. I began requesting larger text for important documents, not as a shameful concession to weakness, but as a practical adaptation to changing circumstances. I started using brighter lamps for evening reading, arranged meetings during hours when my energy was strongest, and delegated tasks that my aging reflexes handled less efficiently than before. Most importantly, I stopped measuring my worth by my youthful capacities and started appreciating the unique gifts that come with accumulated experience. At 20, I had physical strength but little wisdom. At 30, I had energy but limited perspective. At 59, I have something far more valuable than either: the deep understanding that comes only from having lived through multiple cycles of triumph and failure, growth and loss, hope and disappointment. The sundial taught me that aging is not deterioration, it's transformation. Just as the sun's movement creates different patterns of light throughout the day, each beautiful in its own way, human aging creates different capabilities and forms of beauty at each stage of life. In my youth, I could march with legions for days without exhaustion, but I lacked the patience for complex negotiations that required hours of careful listening. Now my body tires more quickly, but my mind has developed the endurance for philosophical contemplation that would have been impossible in my energetic but restless younger years. I began to see my changing body not as a failing machine, but as a teacher offering daily lessons in acceptance. Each new limitation forced me to find creative solutions, to rely more heavily on wisdom rather than physical capability, to develop patience with processes that took longer than they once did. My graying beard became a symbol of authority earned through experience rather than evidence of declining vitality. My lined face reflected years of thoughtful decision-making, under pressure rather than simple deterioration from time's passage. My slower movements demonstrated the deliberate consideration that comes with understanding consequences rather than the hesitation of weakness. I started sharing this perspective with younger administrators who were beginning to notice their own first signs of aging. Instead of joining their laments about lost youth, I helped them recognize the emerging strengths that accompany physical changes: deeper emotional stability, clearer priorities, greater appreciation for life's fleeting pleasures, reduced anxiety about others' opinions. The sundial also reminded me that fighting aging wastes the very energy that aging is supposedly diminishing. Every moment spent resisting natural processes is energy unavailable for adapting to new realities and discovering new possibilities. When you accept that your body will change, you can focus on maintaining what remains strong rather than mourning what has shifted. I developed what I call aging with dignity, a practice of acknowledging physical changes honestly while refusing to let those changes define my sense of purpose or capability. I could no longer personally lead cavalry charges, but I could develop better military strategies. I could no longer stay awake for days handling crises, but I could make more effective decisions during the hours when my mind was sharpest. The deepest lesson of the sundial was that aging provides a unique form of freedom, liberation from the exhausting effort to maintain what cannot be maintained. When you stop trying to preserve your 20-year-old body, you discover the peace of inhabiting whatever body you actually have. When you release attachment to youthful appearance, you can invest energy in developing character that grows more beautiful with time. As I approach my 60th year, I find myself more comfortable in my aging skin than I ever was in my younger flesh. The body that houses my consciousness is changing according to natural law, but the consciousness itself has grown stronger, clearer, and more capable of finding joy in each day's simple pleasures. The sundial's shadows continue their daily movement, marking time's passage without judgment. I watch them with gratitude for the privilege of aging, knowing that many die young and never experience the unique gifts that come only to those who live long enough to receive them. Asterisk. In my study hangs an unfinished detailed plan for conquering territories beyond the Rhine that I spent 3 years developing with my best military minds. We calculated supply lines, estimated troop requirements, analyzed seasonal advantages, and created what I believed was a foolproof strategy for expanding Roman dominion into Germania. The map represents thousands of hours of planning, yet it documents campaigns that will never happen. I keep this map not as a reminder of failure, but as a teacher in the art of holding plans lightly while working diligently. The Germanic expansion was to be my great Lagosia conquest that would secure our northern borders permanently and extend Roman civilization into barbarous lands. I envisioned new cities rising where only forests stood, Roman law replacing tribal customs, and peace emerging from what had been generations of constant warfare. The plan was detailed, logical, and completely realistic based on our military capabilities, but reality, as I was learning, cares nothing for our plans. No matter how carefully constructed, the Antonine Plague struck just as we were finalizing preparations for the campaign. Suddenly, instead of surplus legions available for conquest, I had depleted forces struggling to maintain existing borders. Instead of abundant resources for expansion, I had an empire straining to care for plague victims and maintain basic services. Instead of the stability required for major military ventures, I faced crisis management that consumed every available resource. My first response was fury at the cosmic injustice of it all. How could fate sabotage such carefully laid plans? How could circumstances beyond my control destroy years of strategic preparation? I had followed every principle of good planning: detailed reconnaissance, careful resource allocation, contingency, preparations for various scenarios. Yet none of my contingencies had included a pandemic that would kill millions and reshape the empire's entire strategic situation. The unfinished map became a daily source of frustration as I was forced to abandon conquest dreams and focus on imperial survival. Each time I looked at those detailed invasion routes and supply calculations, I felt the sting of opportunities lost and ambitions thwarted by forces completely beyond my influence. But gradually, the map taught me a crucial distinction: the difference between planning wisely and being attached to specific outcomes. I realized that the planning itself had been valuable even though the planned campaign never occurred. The strategic thinking we developed for Germanic conquest proved useful when adapting to defensive warfare during the plague years. The logistics systems we designed for expansion worked perfectly for organizing relief efforts during the crisis. The military organization we created for conquest campaigns served us well when defending existing territories against opportunistic enemies who sensed our weakness. The planning had not been wasted. It had prepared us for challenges we hadn't anticipated. What had been wasted was my emotional attachment to seeing those specific plans fulfilled exactly as originally envisioned. This insight transformed my approach to all future planning. I continued developing detailed strategies, but I held them more loosely, treating them as tools for thinking clearly about possible futures rather than contracts with destiny about how the future must unfold. When the plague finally ended and military campaigns again became possible, I faced a choice: revive the old Germanic expansion plans or adapt to new realities. The strategic situation had changed completely. Enemy tribes had reorganized during our period of weakness. Our military capabilities had shifted and imperial priorities had evolved. Clinging to outdated plans would have been nostalgia masquerading as strategy. Instead, I developed new plans based on current conditions rather than former ambitions. These adapted strategies proved far more effective than the original conquest plans would have been, because they responded to actual circumstances rather than to the circumstances I had hoped would exist. The unfinished map taught me that good planning serves wisdom, not ego. Plans are tools for organizing our thinking and resources, not prophecies about how the future must develop. When circumstances change, wisdom adapts the plans rather than forcing circumstances to conform to outdated designs. I began teaching this principle to my administrators through a practice I called planning with open hands. We would develop detailed strategies as thoroughly as ever, but we would regularly review and revise them based on changing conditions. Instead of treating plan modifications as failures, we celebrated them as evidence of intelligent adaptation to new information. This approach proved especially valuable during the Marcus Aurelius column campaign against Sarmatian tribes. Our initial strategy assumed certain seasonal conditions and enemy capabilities, but early intelligence revealed that our assumptions were incorrect. Rather than persisting with a flawed plan out of stubbornness, we adapted quickly to new realities and achieved victory through flexibility rather than rigid adherence to original designs. The practice also applied to personal planning. I had envisioned my reign proceeding according to certain patterns, periods of domestic improvement alternating with foreign campaigns, gradual expansion of Roman influence, steady progress toward ideal governance. But reality offered plagues, rebellions, natural disasters, and crises I had never imagined. Instead of mourning the reign I had planned, I learned to embrace the reign I was actually living. The challenges I faced were different from those I had expected, but they provided opportunities for growth and service that my planned reign might never have offered. Managing a plague taught me more about leadership than conquering Germania would have. Surviving betrayal developed wisdom that peaceful expansion could never have provided. The unfinished map now reminds me daily that planning is essential, but attachment to specific outcomes is optional. We must think carefully about the future, prepare diligently for likely challenges, and organize our resources strategically. But we must also remain flexible enough to adapt when reality unfolds differently than we anticipated. The map represents something more profound than military strategy. It symbolizes the human relationship with uncertainty. We can influence the future through intelligent action, but we cannot control it through detailed planning. We can prepare for likely scenarios, but we cannot prevent unlikely scenarios from occurring. We can work toward our goals, but we must accept that our goals may change as we learn more about ourselves and our circumstances. True wisdom lies in planning, as if we could control the future while accepting that we cannot. This paradox, diligent preparation combined with flexible attachment, allows us to work effectively toward our intentions while remaining open to possibilities we never imagined. The unfinished campaign map has become my daily reminder. The best laid plans serve us only when we hold them lightly enough to change them wisely. Asterisk, asterisk, I collect coins from every corner of the empire, not for their monetary value, but for the faces they bear. Each coin shows a different ruler, a different culture, a different way of organizing human society. This collection sits in a special cabinet in my study, reminding me daily that there are as many ways to live a human life as there are humans living them. The coins taught me one of the most difficult lessons in acceptance, releasing the need to control other people's choices and allowing them to walk their own paths, even when those paths seem misguided to my eyes. This lesson began painfully close to home with my son Commodus. From an early age, he showed interests and inclinations that differed sharply from what I had hoped for in my heir. Where I valued philosophical contemplation, he preferred physical competitions. Where I sought wisdom through reading and discussion, he found excitement in gladiatorial games and hunting. Where I tried to embody stoic ideals of simplicity and virtue, he was drawn to luxury and spectacle. My initial response was to intensify my efforts to shape him according to my vision of proper imperial character. I arranged for the finest philosophical tutors, insisted he attend lengthy discussions about governance and ethics, and constantly corrected what I saw as his misguided priorities. I believed that with enough instruction and guidance, I could transform him into the philosophical emperor I thought Rome needed. But the harder I pushed, the more he resisted. The more I criticized his choices, the more defiantly he pursued them. I was creating exactly the opposite dynamic from what I intended. Instead of drawing him toward virtue, my attempts at control were driving him away from the values I hoped to instill. The coin collection provided the insight that changed everything. Looking at those diverse faces, I realized that each represented someone who had found their own way of exercising power and serving their people. Some were warrior kings, others were merchant rulers, still others were priest leaders. None followed exactly the same model, yet many had succeeded in their own contexts and according to their own strengths. This led me to ask a crucial question. Was I trying to help Commodus become the best version of himself, or was I trying to make him into a copy of me? The distinction transformed my entire approach to parenting and leadership. Instead of imposing my path on him, I began trying to understand his natural inclinations and help him develop those gifts in constructive directions. Instead of fighting his love of physical competition, I helped him see how athletic discipline could translate into leadership strength. Instead of condemning his attraction to spectacle, I showed him how public ceremonies could serve important political and cultural functions. This shift required enormous acceptance on my part. I had to release my attachment to having a philosophical successor and embrace the possibility that Rome might be better served by an emperor whose strengths complemented rather than duplicated my own. I had to accept that good leadership comes in many forms, and my son's form might be different from mine without being inferior. The practice expanded beyond family relationships to encompass my entire approach to governing diverse populations. The empire included Greeks who valued intellectual pursuits, Egyptians who revered ancient religious traditions, Gauls who prized martial courage, and dozens of other cultures with their own values and customs. My early impulse had been to rock these populations to gradually convert them to Roman ways of thinking and living. But the coin collection reminded me that diversity of approach often produces better outcomes than uniformity. Greek intellectual traditions enhanced Roman governance. Egyptian administrative systems improved our bureaucracy. Celtic military tactics strengthened our legions. Instead of trying to eliminate these differences, I learned to appreciate and utilize them. I began seeing cultural diversity as a strength rather than a problem to be solved. This led to policies that preserved local customs while integrating them into the broader imperial framework. Instead of forcing everyone to become Roman, I worked to help them become the best versions of themselves, while contributing to our shared civilization. The same principle applied to my relationships with advisors and subordinates. I had initially surrounded myself with people who thought similarly to me, believing this would create harmony and effectiveness. But I discovered that too much similarity actually weakened decision-making because it eliminated the creative tension that comes from diverse perspectives. I began deliberately seeking advisors whose strengths compensated for my weaknesses and whose thinking challenged my assumptions. This required accepting that others might reach different conclusions than I would, make different choices than I preferred, and prioritize different values than I emphasized. The acceptance was difficult, but essentially effective leadership requires input from people who see the world differently than you do. The most challenging application of this principle involved accepting the choices of people I couldn't influence at all. When provincial governors made decisions I disagreed with, when allied kings pursued policies I thought unwise, when citizens chose lifestyles I found puzzling, I had to resist the imperial impulse to control everything and everyone within my sphere of influence. I learned to distinguish between influence and control. I could offer guidance, provide resources, set boundaries, and model better approaches, but I could not reach into other people's minds and rewire their thinking, could not force them to want what I wanted them to want, could not make their decisions for them. This acceptance paradoxically made me more effective at actually influencing others. When people sensed that I wasn't trying to control them, they became more open to considering my suggestions. When they felt accepted for who they were, rather than judged for who they weren't, they became more willing to listen to alternative perspectives. When they experienced respect for their autonomy, they sometimes chose to align with my goals voluntarily. The coin collection now serves as my daily reminder that the world improves not through uniformity, but through diversity guided by shared principles. Each face on those coins represents someone who found their own way to serve their people and fulfill their responsibilities. Not all succeeded equally, but all contributed something unique to the human experiment in civilization. My job as emperor is not to make everyone think like me, but to create conditions where people can think for themselves while choosing to work together toward common goals. The coins remind me that acceptance of others' paths doesn't mean abandoning leadership. It means leading in a way that honors both unity and diversity, both shared purpose and individual expression. True leadership helps people become more themselves, while inspiring them to contribute their unique gifts to something larger than themselves. Asterisk, asterisk, in my private chest, I keep a scroll that contains the most disturbing writing in the empire, not because it describes actual horrors, but because it catalogues potential losses I have imagined in vivid detail. This practice, which Stoics call premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, has become my most powerful tool for building acceptance strength before I need it each morning. I spend time with this scroll, deliberately imagining scenarios I hope will never occur. The death of loved ones, the collapse of the empire, the failure of my policies, my own exile or execution, the destruction of everything I have worked to build. This is not morbid pessimism or self-torture, it is strength training for the soul. The practice began during my early years as emperor when I lived in constant anxiety about potential disasters. Every knock at my chamber door might bring news of rebellion. Every fever suffered by family members might be the beginning of fatal illness. Every military setback might signal the start of imperial collapse. I was exhausting myself, worrying about possibilities rather than dealing with realities. My teacher, Junius Rusticus, introduced me to this ancient Stoic technique as a paradoxical cure for anxiety. If you are afraid of losing something, he explained, practice losing it deliberately in your imagination. If you fear a particular disaster, imagine it happening completely. If you dread a specific pain, experience it mentally before it occurs. Physically, my first attempts at the practice felt like deliberately torturing myself. I would imagine Faustina dying suddenly, picture my children killed in accidents, visualize barbarian armies overrunning Rome. The emotional impact was intense. My heart would race, my breathing would quicken, and I would feel genuine grief for losses that hadn't even occurred. But Rusticus encouraged me to continue the practice, not despite the emotional intensity, but because of it. You are building immunity, he said. Just as physicians sometimes expose patients to small amounts of poison to protect them from larger doses, you are exposing yourself to imaginary loss to strengthen your capacity for handling real loss. Gradually, I began to understand the profound wisdom of this approach. When I imagined losing Faustina, completely her death, funeral, the empty space in our bed, the silence where her voice used to be, I simultaneously discovered my love for her was not diminished by accepting her mortality. Instead, imagining loss made me more grateful for her presence while I still had it. The practice taught me to distinguish between two very different types of emotional experience: the clean pain of actual loss versus the muddy suffering of resistance to potential loss. When I imagined disasters mentally, I could feel the pure grief of separation without the additional agony of fighting against reality. This prepared me to face actual losses with greater equanimity when they inevitably occurred. The most powerful discovery was how premeditatio malorum transformed my daily appreciation of current blessings. After spending 30 minutes imagining the complete destruction of Roman barbarian armies burning the forums, citizens fleeing in terror, centuries of civilization reduced to rubuli, would open my eyes and feel overwhelming gratitude for the actual Rome that still stood strong and beautiful around me. When I imagined losing my sight completely, never again seeing sunsets, faces of loved ones, or words on scrolls, the simple experience of opening my eyes and seeing clearly became a source of profound joy. When I imagined losing my ability to speak, being unable to give commands, share ideas, or express affection, my next conversation felt like a precious gift rather than a routine interaction. The practice also built genuine resilience for handling actual crises. When the Antonine Plague struck and I watched millions die, I was emotionally prepared in ways that would have been impossible without years of imagining such disasters. When Avidius Cassius rebelled and I faced the possibility of losing my throne, I had already mentally rehearsed imperial collapse so thoroughly that the actual crisis felt manageable rather than overwhelming. I began teaching abbreviated versions of this practice to my military commanders. Before major battles, we would spend time imagining total defeat, our armies routed, our plans in ruins, ourselves captured or killed. This wasn't defeatist thinking. It was psychological preparation that allowed us to face real dangers with steady nerves because we had already confronted our worst fears mentally. The technique proved especially valuable for accepting inevitable losses that hadn't yet occurred. I knew that my parents would die before me, that some of my children might predecease me, that my own death was approaching with each passing year. Instead of living in denial of these certainties, I practiced experiencing them imaginatively until I could face them with acceptance rather than panic. The scroll also contains exercises in imagining the loss of everything I took pride in, my reputation destroyed by false accusations, my policies reversed by successors, my philosophical writings dismissed as naive, my military victories forgotten, my legacy reduced to footnotes in other emperors' stories. These mental rehearsals helped me recognize that my sense of worth shouldn't depend on external validation or permanent achievement. Perhaps most importantly, the practice taught me that I could survive anything life might offer. When you have imagined losing everything multiple times and discovered that your essential self remains intact through every imagined catastrophe, you develop unshakable confidence in your capacity to handle whatever actually occurs. The exercises revealed that most of our suffering comes from shock, the gap between what we expected and what we experience. But when you have mentally rehearsed various forms of loss, reality rarely delivers surprises intense enough to overwhelm your prepared psyche. You have already been through the emotional impact in simulation. The actual event feels like something you have handled before. Premeditatio malorum also deepened my appreciation for the temporary nature of all experiences, both pleasant and unpleasant. When I imagined current difficulties lasting forever, I simultaneously imagined them eventually ending, which helped me maintain perspective during actual tough periods. When I imagined current joys being taken away, I appreciated them more fully while they lasted. The practice culminated in what I call total acceptance rehearsal, imagining my own death in various forms and circumstances until I could face mortality with genuine equanimity. By mentally experiencing death repeatedly, I gradually made peace with the ultimate loss and found myself able to live more fully because I was no longer unconsciously defending against the inevitable. This scroll of imagined disasters has become my training manual for accepting whatever reality offers. It reminds me daily that strength comes not from avoiding difficult thoughts, but from facing them deliberately until they lose their power to disturb your peace. Asterisk, asterisk in my palm. I carry a simple river, stone smooth, grey, and utterly ordinary. This pebble, worn by countless years of water flow, has become my most constant teacher in the art of present moment acceptance. When anxiety about the future or regret about the past threatens to steal my peace, I touch this stone and return to the only moment where acceptance actually matters. Now that the stone came from the banks of the Danube during my first Germanic campaign, I was standing knee-deep in the cold river, washing blood from a minor wound, when my mind began its familiar escape from the present moment. Instead of feeling the water's temperature or attending to the simple task of cleaning my injury, I was mentally fighting battles that had already ended and worrying about conflicts that might never occur. That's when I noticed the stone at my feet perfectly still despite the rushing current, shaped by centuries of accepting whatever the river offered without resistance. I picked it up and felt its weight, its texture, its temperature. For the first time in days, my mind became completely quiet, focused entirely on the immediate sensory experience of holding a smooth rock in my hand. This moment of pure presence revealed something profound. Most of our suffering comes not from present circumstances, but from mental time travel, revisiting painful pasts or rehearsing fearful futures. The actual present moment, when we can fully experience it, is almost always manageable, often peaceful, and sometimes beautiful. The stone became my anchor to this truth. Whenever I felt overwhelmed by imperial responsibilities, I would hold it and ask, What exactly is happening right now? Not what happened yesterday, or what might happen tomorrow, but what is actually occurring in this specific moment. Usually, the answer was surprisingly simple. I am sitting in a chair, holding a stone, breathing normally, safe and comfortable. This practice proved revolutionary during the plague years. Instead of torturing myself with thoughts about the millions who had already died or fears about millions more who might die, I learned to focus on present realities, the specific people I could help today, the particular decisions that needed my attention now, the immediate actions available to me in this moment. The stone taught me that acceptance is always a present tense practice. You cannot accept yesterday's events, they are finished and beyond change. You cannot accept tomorrow's possibilities, they haven't occurred yet and may never happen. You can only accept what is actually happening right now, in this moment, in the circumstances that currently surround you. I began developing what I called stone practices, brief exercises in radical presence that could be performed anywhere, anytime. My mind started escaping into temporal territories where acceptance was impossible. When receiving disturbing news, instead of immediately projecting catastrophic futures, I would touch the stone and focus completely on the messenger's words, the temperature of the room, the sensation of my feet on the floor. This present moment focus revealed how often our emotional reactions have nothing to do with current circumstances and everything to do with stories we're telling ourselves about what current circumstances might mean for the future. A senator's criticism would send me into anxiety spirals, not because of his actual words, but because I was imagining how his opposition might grow into broader rebellion. A military setback would trigger despair, not because of the immediate tactical loss, but because I was extrapolating it into complete strategic failure. The stone helped me separate immediate facts from projected interpretations. The senator had spoken critical words that was present reality. The possibility that his criticism might inspire others to revolt, there was mental time travel to imaginary futures. By staying with present facts, I could respond to actual situations, rather than to fears about potential developments. This practice proved especially powerful during personal relationships. When Commodus made choices I disapproved of, my initial tendency was to catastrophize about what his current behavior might mean for his future character and the empire's eventual fate. But the stone brought me back to present reality. My son had made a specific choice that I could address through immediate conversation and guidance. The rest was speculation that prevented me from dealing effectively with current opportunities for influence. I started teaching abbreviated versions of stone practice to my advisors. When meetings became heated with arguments about past mistakes or future disasters, I would call for stone moments, brief periods where we focused only on present circumstances and immediate options. These interventions consistently improved our decision-making by eliminating the emotional contamination that comes from temporal, mental wandering. The most profound discovery was how present moment acceptance transforms the quality of experience itself. When you're fully present with pleasant circumstances, the pleasure intensifies, because your attention isn't divided between enjoying now and worrying about when the pleasure will end. When you're fully present with difficult circumstances, the pain becomes more manageable, because you're not adding the extra suffering of resistance or the amplified anxiety of imagining that current difficulties will last forever. During my final years, as I write these words on the Danube frontier, knowing death may come at any moment, the stone provides constant comfort. Instead of filling my remaining days with regret about unfinished business or anxiety about posthumous reputation, I can focus completely on each day's simple gifts: morning sunlight on my writing table, the taste of bread and wine, conversations with soldiers who trust my leadership, the satisfaction of recording these thoughts for future readers. The stone reminds me that this moment, whatever it contains, is the only place where life actually happens. The past lives only in memory, the future only in imagination. But this breath, this heartbeat, this sensation of stone and palm, these exist in the realm of reality where acceptance can transform suffering into peace. Present moment acceptance doesn't mean ignoring the past or failing to plan for the future. It means doing your remembering and planning from a place of centeredness in current reality, rather than getting lost in temporal fantasies that disconnect you from your actual power to influence circumstances. The simple river stone has taught me that every moment offers the same choice. I can be present with what is actually happening and respond with wisdom, or I can escape into mental time travel and react from confusion. Acceptance becomes not only possible, but natural when practiced in the eternal now, where life actually unfolds. The stone sits in my palm as I write these final words, connecting me to this moment of sharing ancient wisdom with future readers I will never meet. This is where acceptance lives, not in grand philosophical theories, but in the simple practice of being fully present with whatever now contains. Asterisk, asterisk, the imperial ring sits on my desk, heavy gold bearing the seal of Roman authority, that I will soon pass to my son Commodus. This ring represents everything I have worked to build and protect, yet it also symbolizes the ultimate acceptance, letting go of control over what happens after I am gone. For most of my reign, I tormented myself with questions about legacy. What would future historians write about my leadership? Would the policies I established survive my successors? Would the empire I strengthened continue to flourish, or would it decline after my death? Would my philosophical writings influence future generations, or would they be forgotten as the naive musings of an emperor who should have focused on practical governance? These concerns about posthumous reputation consumed enormous mental energy that could have been better spent governing effectively during the time actually available to me. I was so focused on controlling my historical image that I sometimes neglected opportunities to serve well in present moments. The turning point came during a conversation with my physician, Galen, about the inevitability of physical death. Caesar, he said, you have accepted that your body will die, but you are still fighting to make your influence immortal. This is another form of resistance to impermanence. His words struck me like lightning. I had learned to accept the mortality of my flesh while clinging desperately to the fantasy of permanent legacy. I was trying to make temporary achievements eternal, to control the future through current actions, to guarantee that my work would outlast the inevitable decay that claims everything in the material world. The imperial ring became my teacher. In the final form of acceptance, releasing attachment to outcomes beyond my lifetime, I began practicing what I called legacy meditation, deliberately imagining scenarios where my work would be completely undone by future generations. I visualized Commodus reversing my policies, subsequent emperors abandoning my approaches to governance, historians dismissing my reign as insignificant, my philosophical writings lost or ignored, the very empire I served eventually crumbling into fragments. Initially, these mental exercises produced intense anxiety. My ego screamed against the possibility that my life's work might prove temporary or ineffective. But gradually, I began to see the liberation hidden within this ultimate acceptance. If my legacy was destined to be temporary, and all human legacies are temporary, then I could stop trying to control the uncontrollable and focus entirely on the work itself rather than its posthumous reception. I could govern with integrity because governance itself was meaningful, not because I could guarantee that future emperors would maintain my standards. I could write philosophical insights because the process of thinking deeply about life was intrinsically valuable, not because I could ensure that future readers would appreciate my conclusions. This shift freed me from the paralysis of trying to create permanent solutions to temporary problems. Instead of exhausting myself attempting to design policies that no successor could modify, I focused on establishing principles flexible enough to guide different approaches to changing circumstances. Instead of trying to make my specific methods immortal, I worked to embody timeless values that others could express through their own methods. The ring also taught me about the difference between influence and control. I could influence the future through the quality of my present actions, the people I trained, the institutions I strengthened, and the examples I set. But I could not control how future generations would interpret my influence or what they would choose to do with the tools I provided. This distinction transformed my approach to succession planning. Instead of trying to shape Commodus into a copy of myself, I focused on preparing him to handle imperial responsibilities according to his own strengths and the circumstances he would face. Instead of demanding that he commit to maintaining my specific policies, I worked to help him understand the underlying principles that could guide his own decision-making. I began seeing my role not as the creator of permanent structures, but as a temporary steward of ongoing processes. The empire existed before my birth and would continue after my death. My job was to serve it well during my brief time of responsibility, not to control its eternal destiny. This perspective eliminated the crushing pressure of trying to solve problems permanently and allowed me to address them effectively within my limited time frame. The practice of legacy letting go also deepened my appreciation for the work itself. When you stop measuring activities by their potential for creating lasting fame, you discover the intrinsic satisfaction of doing meaningful work well. Governing with wisdom becomes rewarding because good governance benefits people now, not because it might impress future historians. Writing philosophical insights becomes fulfilling because the process of understanding life has immediate value, not because the resulting texts might achieve immortality. I realized that the desire to control legacy often corrupts the very activities we hope will create lasting positive impact. When you govern primarily to build historical reputation, you make different choices than when you govern primarily to serve current citizens. When you write mainly to achieve intellectual immortality, you produce different thoughts than when you write mainly to understand truth. The imperial ring now serves as my daily reminder that excellence comes from releasing attachment to permanence. Every morning, I touch this symbol of temporary authority and remember that my influence is borrowed, not owned. I have been granted the privilege of serving something larger than myself for a limited time. When that time ends, the responsibility will pass to others who must find their own ways of serving. This acceptance has brought profound peace to my final years. Instead of anxiously trying to micromanage posthumous outcomes, I can invest my remaining energy in present opportunities for service. Instead of worrying about whether future generations will remember me favorably, I can focus on whether current actions reflect the principles I believe in. The ring reminds me that true legacy lies not in controlling the future, but in serving the present so well that the future inherits valuable examples to adapt rather than problems to solve. My work will be temporary, but if it serves truth and compassion effectively during its brief existence, it will have fulfilled its purpose regardless of how long it lasts. When I pass this ring to Commodus, I will be practicing the ultimate acceptance, trusting that what I have contributed will find its way into the ongoing human story in whatever form serves the greater good, even if that form differs completely from what I might have chosen. I write these final words by lamplight in my tent on the Danube frontier, knowing they may be my last. The fever that has been building for days grows stronger, and I feel death approaching like a familiar visitor I have long expected. On the table beside my writing materials lies a parchment containing my final thoughts on acceptance, words I hope will outlive this failing body and serve others who struggle, as I have struggled, to make peace with unchangeable realities. After 19 years as emperor and 59 years of life, I have learned that acceptance is not a destination, but a practice, a daily choice to work with reality rather than against it. Every morning has offered new opportunities to either fight what cannot be changed or embrace what can be transformed through wise response. The scroll beside me summarizes the essential insights that have guided my journey from resistance to peace. Let me share them with you as my final gift, not as commands from an emperor, but as discoveries from a fellow human who has wrestled with the same fundamental challenges that face every conscious being. First, learn to distinguish clearly between what belongs to you and what belongs to the world. Your thoughts, judgments, values, and responses are your private kingdom. No external force can rule there without your permission. Everything else, other people's choices, natural disasters, the past, the future, the length of your life belongs to the vast realm of circumstances beyond human control. Master this distinction, and you will find the freedom that no earthly power can grant or remove. Second, understand that resistance to unchangeable facts creates all unnecessary suffering. Pain is inevitable when living beings encounter loss, disappointment, and mortality. But the additional torment of fighting reality, raging that things should be different than they are, is optional suffering we add to unavoidable pain. When you stop wasting energy on resistance, you discover reserves of strength for adapting wisely to whatever circumstances present themselves. Third, practice loving without possessiveness. Everything you cherish, family, friends, health, achievement, life itself, is temporarily on loan from the universe. Appreciate these gifts fully while you have them, but hold them lightly enough to release them gracefully when their time ends. This approach deepens rather than diminishes love, because it eliminates the fear and clinging that poison authentic affection. Fourth, accept the impermanence of all achievements and identities. Your body will age and die. Your work will eventually be forgotten or superseded. Your influence will fade as new generations find their own approaches to life's challenges. This is not tragedy, but natural law. When you stop trying to make temporary things permanent, you can invest full energy in serving truth and goodness during whatever time you have been granted. Fifth, train your mind to find meaning in response rather than in control. You cannot determine what happens to you, but you can determine what happens through you. This distinction transforms you from a victim of circumstances into a collaborator with destiny. When you measure success by the wisdom and compassion of your responses rather than by your ability to manipulate outcomes, you discover a satisfaction that no external setback can destroy. Sixth, develop the discipline of perspective that separates events from interpretations. Most suffering comes not from what occurs, but from the stories you tell yourself about what occurred. Practice seeing situations from multiple angles until you find interpretations that promote effective action rather than emotional paralysis. This skill allows you to respond to reality rather than to mental narratives about reality. Seventh, remember that acceptance does not mean passivity. True acceptance often requires tremendous activity, not fighting unchangeable facts, but working skillfully with whatever conditions actually exist. The farmer who accepts drought doesn't abandon his fields. He adapts his methods to conserve water. The leader who accepts crisis doesn't resign in despair. She mobilizes resources to serve people through difficulty. Finally, understand that acceptance is ultimately about coming home to yourself. When you stop demanding that the world conform to your preferences, you discover the peace that was always available in the depths of your own consciousness. This peace does not depend on external circumstances arranging themselves according to your desires. It emerges from aligning yourself with the fundamental nature of existence itself, permanent, interconnected, and ultimately meaningful in ways beyond human comprehension. As I prepare to practice the ultimate acceptance, by releasing this life gracefully. I feel profound gratitude for the privilege of having served something larger than myself during my brief time of responsibility. The empire will continue after my death, led by others who must find their own ways of serving Rome's destiny. My philosophical insights will be judged by future readers who may find wisdom or folly in these words. The relationships I have cherished will be transformed by my absence, but the love that created them will remain part of the world's eternal fabric. This is my final testament. Acceptance is not surrender, but liberation. When you stop fighting reality, you discover your true power to shape what can be shaped while finding peace with what cannot be changed. This wisdom has sustained me through plague and war, betrayal and loss, the burdens of leadership and the approach of death. May these words serve you as the teachings of Epictetus and other Stoic masters have served me, not as rigid doctrines to be followed blindly, but as invitations to discover your own path to the serenity that comes from making peace with the unchangeable while working courageously to improve what remains within your influence. The fever grows stronger as I write these final sentences. Soon I will have the opportunity to practice everything I have learned about acceptance by facing the one change that no human power can resist. I approach this final lesson not with fear, but with curiosity about what lies beyond the reach of earthly philosophy. Remember, you cannot control what happens to you, but you can always choose how to respond. In that choice lies all the freedom and peace any human being can ever truly possess.